The ballroom at Devonshire House blazed with the light of 1,000 candles, their flames reflected in the polished mirrors that lined the walls. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax, hothouse gardenias, and the rustling silk of 100 gowns. Catherine, Duchess of Ashworth, stood near a marble pillar at the edge of the dance floor, her gloved fingers resting lightly on the stem of a champagne flute she had not sipped from in over an hour. She was 23 years old, married to one of the wealthiest men in England, and she had never felt so completely unseen. Her husband, Alexander Montclair, the Duke of Ashworth, stood at the far end of the room with Lord Harrowby and Sir David Poole, his dark head inclined in conversation. He had not looked at her once since they arrived. He had escorted her through the receiving line with mechanical precision, his hand barely touching her elbow, and then he had abandoned her to her own devices, as he always did. 2 years of marriage, 2 years of sitting across a vast mahogany dining table, of sharing a carriage in utter silence, of lying in separate bedchambers while the London gossip speculated on the absence of an heir. 2 years, and he had never once asked her to dance. Catherine watched the couples moving through the figures of a cotillion. She had once loved to dance, as a girl in Somerset, before her father had arranged her marriage to a man who regarded her as little more than a necessary furnishing. She had been presented to the Duke at a house party when she was 19, pretty, dutiful, and possessed of a respectable dowry. He had been 31, handsome in a cold, sculpted way, and clearly uninterested in acquiring a wife. But his duty to the title had demanded an heir, and so he had chosen her as one might choose a well-bred mare. The music swelled. Catherine set down her glass and turned toward the terrace doors, intending to seek the cool night air, when a voice stopped her. "Your Grace." She looked up. Viscount Westbrook stood before her, bowing with an easy grace that matched his reputation. He was fair-haired, green-eyed, and possessed of a smile that had set many a debutante's heart fluttering. He had been abroad for the past 3 years, she recalled, managing his family's interests in the West Indies. His return to London society had been the subject of considerable talk. "Lord Westbrook," she said, inclining her head. "I have been standing across the room for the better part of a quarter hour," he said, his tone warm, "wondering why the most elegant woman in the ballroom has not been asked to dance, and then I realized I was being given a gift. May I have the honor?" Catherine hesitated. She could feel the weight of observation, the speculative glances from the matrons who had long since written her off as a social nonentity. Dancing with a viscount, and a notably charming one at that, would invite commentary. But the alternative was another hour of standing alone while her husband ignored her existence. She placed her hand in his. "I would be delighted, my lord." Lord Westbrook led her onto the floor just as the orchestra struck up a waltz. His hand settled at her waist with respectful lightness, and he guided her into the steps with a natural assurance. Catherine felt a strange, almost painful sensation, the simple pleasure of being noticed. She smiled, and the expression felt foreign on her face, like a language she had forgotten how to speak. Across the room, the Duke of Ashworth had fallen silent mid-sentence. He had seen the Viscount bow, had seen his wife's pale hand extend, had seen the smile that bloomed on her lips. His hand tightened around his glass, the crystal stem threatening to snap. Lord Harrowby followed his gaze. "Westbrook seems taken with your Duchess, Ashworth." The Duke did not reply. He watched the couple move across the floor, the Viscount's fair head bent close to Catherine's dark one, and something hot and possessive coiled in his chest, a sensation entirely unfamiliar and thoroughly unwelcome. He had never danced with his Duchess. He had never once thought to ask. And now, watching another man hold her, he found he could not look away. The waltz ended, and Lord Westbrook returned Catherine to her place near the pillar with a lingering bow. He held her hand a fraction longer than propriety permitted and murmured something that made her color rise. The Duke, observing from across the room, felt his jaw clench until his teeth ached. The carriage ride home was a study in suffocating silence. Catherine sat opposite her husband, watching the gaslit streets of Mayfair slide past the window. The Duke's profile was rigid, his gaze fixed on some point beyond the velvet curtain. She did not expect him to speak. He never did. But as the carriage turned into Grosvenor Square, his voice cut through the darkness. "You seem to enjoy yourself this evening." It was not a question. Catherine turned her head slowly. "I did, thank you. Lord Westbrook is a pleasant partner." Westbrook. The name fell from his lips like a stone. "You would do well to remember that you are the Duchess of Ashworth, not some country miss free to giggle with every fortune hunter who asks her to dance." Catherine felt the sting of the words, but she did not flinch. "He asked me to dance because no one else would. I have stood in ballrooms for 2 years, Alexander, while you converse with your friends and pretend I do not exist. Forgive me if I accepted a moment of courtesy." The Duke's eyes met hers, and for an instant something flickered in their depths, surprise perhaps, or the first stirring of guilt. Then the mask descended once more. "See that it does not happen again." The carriage stopped. A footman opened the door, and Catherine descended without waiting for her husband's hand. The next morning, a delivery arrived at Ashworth House, a lavish arrangement of white roses and blush peonies, tied with a silk ribbon. The card bore a single line in a bold hand, "To the Duchess who outshone every candle in the room." It was signed with the Viscount's name. Catherine stood in the morning room, the bouquet cradled in her arms, and felt a dangerous warmth spread through her chest. She had not received flowers from anyone since her wedding day, when her husband had sent a formal arrangement of lilies with a card that had read simply, "Ashworth." The Duke found her there an hour later, still holding the roses. He had come to retrieve a ledger from the adjoining study, but he stopped in the doorway, his gaze falling on the bouquet. "Who sent those?" he demanded, though the answer was already written in the tightening of his features. "Lord Westbrook," Catherine said. She did not hide them, she did not apologize. He crossed the room in 3 strides and plucked the card from the arrangement. He read it, his lips thinning into a bloodless line. "You will return these." "I will not." She met his gaze without wavering. "They were sent to me, and I shall keep them if I choose." The air between them crackled. The Duke was a man accustomed to command, to unhesitating obedience from everyone in his orbit. His wife had always been quiet, compliant, a shadow in the corners of his life. This woman standing before him, chin lifted and eyes bright, was someone he did not recognize. "You are behaving foolishly," he said, his voice low. "Westbrook is a known flirt. He will dangle his attentions before you until he grows bored, and then you will be left with nothing but ridicule." "I have lived with indifference for 2 years," Catherine replied. "Ridicule would be a change at least." She set the bouquet on a side table and walked past him, her skirts brushing the doorway. The Duke remained motionless, the Viscount's card crumpled in his fist, staring at the roses as though they were an indictment. She had never walked away from him before. It felt, he thought, like a door closing. Lord Westbrook called at Ashworth House the following afternoon, impeccably dressed in a blue riding coat and top boots, and invited the Duchess to drive with him through Hyde Park. Catherine, seated in the drawing room with her embroidery, felt her heart quicken. She knew the invitation was bold, perhaps even improper for a married woman without her husband's escort. But the Duke had left for his club an hour earlier, and she was weary of being proper. "I would enjoy that very much, my lord," she said. The drive was everything she had not known she craved. The Viscount's phaeton was a high-perch vehicle that drew the eye of every pedestrian along Rotten Row. He spoke to her of his travels, of turquoise seas and spice-scented markets, of islands where the sun set in streaks of molten gold. He asked her questions and listened to her answers. He laughed when she made a dry observation about a matron's feathered turban, and his laughter was genuine and infectious. It was the most pleasant hour Catherine had spent in recent memory. But as the phaeton turned back toward Mayfair, she caught sight of a familiar figure standing at the window of White's bow window. The Duke of Ashworth, his face a mask of stone, watched the vehicle pass with an expression that bordered on violence. He was waiting for her in the library when she returned. The room was dim, the curtains half drawn, and he stood before the empty grate like a sentinel carved from granite. "You defied me," he said, his voice quiet and all the more dangerous for it. Catherine removed her gloves, one finger at a time. "You did not ask, you commanded. There is a difference. I am your husband. You are a man who has not spoken a full sentence to me in 2 years outside of public functions." She laid the gloves on a side table. "I have been obedient, Alexander. I have been silent and accommodating, and so utterly invisible that even the servants have begun to overlook me. I will no longer live as a ghost in your house." The words hung in the air, stark and irrefutable. The Duke stared at her, and for the first time, Catherine saw something other than cold indifference in his expression. She saw confusion, and beneath it, a tremor of fear. He cleared his throat. "What do you want?" "I want to be seen," she said. "I want to dance and laugh and be spoken to as though my thoughts have value. If you cannot give me that, then do not begrudge me the company of those who can." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Catherine." She paused, her hand on the doorframe. He had not spoken her name with anything but formality in years. "I have secured a box at the opera this evening," he said, each word seeming to cost him. "I would be pleased if you would accompany me." She turned back, studying his face for any sign of mockery. There was none. He looked, she thought, like a man standing on uncertain ground for the first time in his life. "Very well," she said, "but I will not be ignored, Alexander, not tonight, not ever again." He inclined his head, and in the dim light she could have sworn she saw the ghost of something like hope in his eyes. The Royal Opera House was a blaze of crimson velvet and gilded plasterwork. The Duke of Ashworth led his wife to their box with a hand pressed gently to the small of her back, a gesture so unfamiliar that Catherine nearly stumbled. Heads turned as they passed. The Tun had long since catalogued the Ashworth marriage as a cold arrangement, and the sight of the Duke attending his Duchess with such marked attention was enough to fuel a week's worth of speculation. He saw her seated, ordered champagne, and even commented on the overture. His conversation was stilted, the effort of a man unpracticed in small talk, but Catherine recognized it for what it was, an olive branch extended across a chasm of his own making. Then, during the interval, Lord Westbrook appeared at the door of their box. He bowed to the Duke with impeccable courtesy and turned to Catherine with a smile that held no trace of guile. "Your Grace, I hoped I might find you here. I wish to ask, will you save me a dance at Lady Harlow's ball next week? I have not forgotten how well we moved together." Catherine felt her husband stiffen beside her. The Duke's hand, resting on the velvet arm of his chair, went white-knuckled. She saw him open his mouth to intervene, but something in her, some remnant of the woman who had stood alone at 100 balls, made her speak first. "I shall consider it, my lord," she said, her tone light but non-committal. "You may ask me again on the night." Westbrook's smile widened. He bowed again and withdrew, leaving a charged silence in his wake. The Duke did not speak until they were seated in the carriage, the horses' hooves clattering on cobblestones. Then he turned to her, and the mask he had worn for 2 years finally cracked. "You intend to dance with him?" It was not a question. "I may," he asks, and he does so with genuine warmth. "That is more than I have ever received from you." He flinched. The great Duke of Ashworth, master of 100,000 acres and a seat in the House of Lords, flinched at his wife's quiet words. "I never wanted this marriage," he said, the confession raw and unvarnished. "My father arranged it when I was still grieving a woman I could not have. I blamed you for a crime you did not commit. I thought if I kept my distance, I could pretend none of it was real." He drew a shaking breath. "But watching Westbrook ask you to dance, watching you smile at him, I cannot pretend any longer. The thought of you with another man makes me half mad." Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs. "What do you want from me, Alexander?" "Dance with me," he said, his voice rough. "At Lady Harlow's ball. Give me the first waltz. Give me a chance to prove that I am not the cold-hearted fool I have been." She looked at him, at the lines of strain around his mouth, at the desperate sincerity in his eyes, and felt something long buried shift inside her. "One waltz," she said, "but know this, I will not be an afterthought any longer. If you want my heart, you will have to earn it." The Duke reached across the carriage and took her hand, his grip warm and steady. "Then I shall spend the rest of my life trying," he said. Lady Harlow's ball was the crowning event of the late autumn season. The ballroom shimmered with thousands of candles suspended in crystal chandeliers, and the orchestra was the finest to be had in London. Catherine descended the grand staircase on her husband's arm, wearing a gown of deep sapphire silk that brought out the hidden depths of her dark eyes. Society had never seen the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth arrive together with such palpable connection, and the whispers began before they even reached the floor. The Duke claimed her for a quadrille, and they danced together with a careful, testing grace. Two people learning the steps of a partnership neither had ever truly practiced. But before the waltz could be announced, Lord Harlow himself approached the Duke with an urgent message from the Prince Regent, who had arrived unexpectedly and wished to speak on a matter of parliamentary significance. The Duke hesitated, his eyes finding Catherine. "I will return," he promised. She watched him go, a knot of old disappointment tightening in her chest. The Prince Regent would keep him for an hour at least, and the waltz was about to begin. Lord Westbrook materialized at her elbow. "Your Grace," he said, bowing, "I believe I was promised the opportunity to ask again. May I have this dance?" It was the second time he had asked her. The first had been at Devonshire House, the night everything had begun to change. Catherine gazed across the ballroom toward the door through which her husband had vanished, and then she placed her hand in the Viscount. "You may," she said. They took their places on the floor as the opening strains of a Viennese waltz filled the room. Westbrook's hand settled at her waist, and they began to turn in slow, sweeping revolutions. He was a polished dancer, and Catherine found herself smiling despite the ache of disappointment that lingered beneath her ribs. Then the music faltered. A ripple of shocked murmurs spread through the crowd, and Catherine felt the Viscount's grip loosen. She turned her head. The Duke of Ashworth was striding through the sea of dancers, his eyes blazing with a fire that silenced every whisper in its path. He stopped before them, and his voice, when he spoke, carried to every corner of the room. "My Lord Westbrook, I must beg your pardon. This dance belongs to me." The Viscount, to his credit, released her with a bow and a rueful smile. "Of course, Your Grace. I would not dream of standing between a man and his Duchess." And then, before the assembled eyes of the entire ton, the Duke of Ashworth took his wife in his arms and began to waltz. He had never danced with her, not once, but his movements were sure and powerful, and he held her closer than was strictly proper, his cheek nearly brushing her temple. Catherine could feel the rapid beat of his heart beneath her palm. "I will not share you," he murmured against her ear. "Not with Westbrook, not with any man. You are my wife, and I have been a blind, arrogant fool." She drew back just enough to meet his eyes. "You never wanted me before." "I was a fool," he repeated. "Let me prove I am no longer one." The waltz ended, and the room erupted in stunned applause, whether for the dance or the unprecedented spectacle of the Duke's public declaration. No one could say. But Catherine, breathless and trembling with a hope she had long since buried, looked at her husband and saw, for the first time, the man she might one day love. The days that followed were unlike any Catherine had known. The Duke of Ashworth, who had once moved through his household like a spectre, now appeared at breakfast with fresh-cut flowers from the conservatory. He requested her company on morning rides through the park and listened with genuine interest when she spoke of the books she was reading. He sent a delicate gold bracelet to her rooms, engraved on the inside with their entwined initials and a single word: begin. She wore it every day. The ton watched the transformation with a mixture of delight and envy. Some, like Lady Jersey, pronounced it charming. Others, like the Dowager Countess of Merton, who had long harbored hopes of her own daughter catching the Duke's eye, watched with lips pursed in displeasure. It was the Dowager Countess who struck the blow. At a soirée at Lady Sefton's, she remarked within earshot of half the room that the Duchess of Ashworth had been seen driving alone with Viscount Westbrook on more than one occasion, and that the Viscount's attentions had not appeared unwelcome. The implication was unmistakable. The rumor reached the Duke within the hour. He found the Dowager Countess holding court near the fireplace and approached with an expression of icy composure that made lesser mortals step aside. "Lady Merton," he said, his voice carrying with surgical precision, "I understand you have taken an interest in my wife's social engagements. Allow me to clarify. The Duchess drives with whom she pleases, and she does so with my full knowledge and support. Viscount Westbrook is a friend to our family, and any suggestion to the contrary is a slander I will not tolerate." The Dowager Countess turned the color of soured milk. "I merely repeated what I had heard." "Then hear this," the Duke interrupted. "My wife's honor is beyond question. Anyone who impugns it will answer to me. Is that understood?" The silence that followed was profound. Lady Merton nodded, a tight, furious jerk of her chin, and the Duke turned his back on her with the finality of a slammed door. Catherine, who had witnessed the exchange from across the room, felt her throat tighten with emotion. She had never had a champion before. She had never known what it meant to be defended. That night she went to his study. He was seated at his desk, a stack of estate papers before him, and he looked up with a weariness that vanished the moment he saw her face. "You defended me," she said. He rose. "I will always defend you." She crossed the room and placed her hand over his where it rested on the desk. His fingers turned beneath hers, interlacing, holding on as though she were an anchor in a storm. "Then perhaps," she said, "it is time we truly began." He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, his eyes bright with a feeling too vast for words. The Duke arranged a private dinner in the intimate dining room that overlooked the rear gardens. The table was set for two, lit by a single branch of candles, and the fire in the great sent flickering shadows dancing across the walls. Catherine entered to find her husband waiting, a velvet box in his hands. "This is not more jewelry," she said, a tentative smile playing at her lips. "It is not." He placed the box in her hands. Inside lay a letter folded and sealed with the Ashworth crest. "Read it," he said. "I have never been skilled with spoken words, so I wrote down everything I could not say." She broke the seal and read. The letter was not long, but every line was a revelation. He wrote of his grief, his misguided coldness, the slow awakening he had felt when he saw her standing alone at Devonshire House. He wrote of the terror that had seized him when Westbrook took her hand, and the shame that had followed when he realized he had no right to be jealous. He wrote that he loved her, and that he would spend every remaining day of his life proving it if she would only allow him the chance. Catherine's vision blurred. She looked up to find him on one knee before her, his proud head bowed. "I am asking for nothing less than your heart," he said. "I know I have not earned it, but I will if you let me try." She reached down and took his face between her hands, lifting his gaze to hers. "I have loved you since the day we were married," she said, the words cracking with the weight of 2 years of silence. "I buried it so deep I thought it had died, but it never did. It was only waiting for you to come and find it." He rose and gathered her into his arms, and they stood together in the candlelight, two people who had been strangers in the same house, finally coming home. The next grand ball was Lord and Lady Jersey's annual affair. The Duke and Duchess of Ashworth arrived together, and this time he did not leave her side. When the orchestra struck up a waltz, he led her onto the floor without hesitation, and they danced as they had at Harlow's, but this time with the easy grace of a couple who had found their rhythm. When the music ended, he did not release her hand. Instead, he lifted it to his lips before the entire assembly and said, loud enough for those nearest to hear, "My Duchess, my heart." Viscount Westbrook, watching from the edge of the floor, raised his glass in a silent toast and smiled. The Duke danced with his wife twice more that night, a country dance and another waltz, and when they finally climbed into their carriage in the small hours of the morning, Catherine leaned her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes. "You have set a precedent," she murmured. "I shall expect you to dance with me at every ball from now on." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "That," he said, "has been my intention all along." And he never danced with anyone else again.